Spider-Man. You cannot marry a woman without gills. You're from two different worlds. Oh, I've wasted my life.
I feel like a recent trend on my channel has been talking about comics based on different cartoons and how important they are to the cartoon's overall stories. Which is strange that it's even a question considering how high the importance of comic books have been in the past. At one point in time, the popularity for comic books and the stories they told were at the forefront of storytelling for our favorite characters. If we wanted to know what Spider-Man was up to, we'd check the most recent comics. If we wanted to know what Batman was up to, we'd check his comics. But now it seems the opposite is true. It seems like if most people wanted to check up on their favorite characters today, they just go to the movies for information, while the comics take a back seat. The people's new choice for continuity seems to be seen anywhere else. Could be cartoons, could be video games, could be movies. But where does that leave the comics? How much say does a modern comic book have in terms of these characters' ongoing stories? Have audiences grown past them? Are they still seen as the main canon? Does canon outside of your main source matter to you personally? Now I obviously can't answer that for you, but hopefully after watching this video both of us can come to our own conclusions on the topic. So are Cartoon Network's comics canon? Let's find out. But before we start, I'd like to say thank you so much for 1,000 subscribers. I can ramble on and on about how much this means to me. I'm so appreciative of all of you and everyone who comes out to support me and watch my videos every week. I can express how much love I have for this community, and this is just the beginning. So if you haven't yet, consider joining the Discord. The link will be in the bio, and fill up the comments with any ideas you have for new videos. Any idea you have for new videos. I love hearing your ideas. I'm all ears. I'm very interested to hear what you guys have to say. So feel free to comment anything down. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you. Cartoon Network has really put themselves out there when it comes to making comics. Almost every single show either has a comic or has shown up in a comic. Samurai Jack, Ben 10, Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, Ed, Edd and Eddy, the Powerpuff Girls, you name it, it's there. And if my research is correct, Cartoon Network started publishing comics in 1997 with their Cartoon Network Presents label. These comics were published under and distributed by DC Comics. Yes, the DC Comics. The Cartoon Network Presents line of comics would run from 1997 to 1999 and weirdly enough weren't really connected to each other. It wasn't just one linear story. Instead, they debuted with Dexter's Laboratory issue number 1, and then for issue number 2 we got Space Ghost Coast to Coast. This would go on for 24 issues and would rotate Cartoon Network shows, Boomerang shows, and even some Toonami Presents issues in there. But for the most part, these were just fun little one-off adventures. Nothing that seemed too worrisome. Surely these one-off comics can't completely disrupt these shows' canon. Which would eventually be the start of the network deciding to add a bit more lore to their comic stories with Dexter's Laboratory. The Dexter's comics were successful enough to spawn their own run of comics in 1999, outside of the Cartoon Network's Presents line. These comics would last 34 issues and run until 2003. And we'll get to what those did for its continuity a bit later, but it seems as if Cartoon Network were distributing the different comics under the same line so they could test which characters would be popular enough to stand on their own. So, after the success of the first 24 issues, they would revamp Cartoon Network's Presents to Cartoon Network Starring in 1999. This would end up going for 18 issues, and similar to what came before, each comic issue would end and a new character story would begin. The first issue being the Powerpuff Girls Go Girls Go, then Johnny Bravo would make his comic debut. And from there we get more Space Ghost Coast to Coast and Cow and Chicken, but no Dexter's Laboratory because he had comics already running at the time. And unlike before, there would be no mention of Toonami by name despite the fact that they were still using Toonami characters. But out of all the characters they made issues for, the Powerpuff Girls would be the only one to get their own run of comics in the similar vein to how Dexter did. Which sucks for Johnny Bravo and poor Space Ghost though. The Powerpuff Girls comic would span 70 issues and run from 2000 to 2006 under the DC label. Remember that. I know it's a lot to remember, but it's important because Cartoon Network changes distributors a lot. The Powerpuff Girls comic would be very popular and have a lot of steam behind it, so of course Cartoon Network wanted to see what else they could capitalize on. So they dive head first and just throw whatever they could at the wall. So in 2001, they would release the Cartoons run of comics that would run until 2004. Here they make 33 comics and had a far wider variety of characters. Ed, Ed and Eddie, Courage, Space Ghost, Johnny Bravo, Sheep in the Big City, I Am Weasel, Billy and Mandy, formerly Grim and Evil, and even Kids Next Door. The first comic they released in this line was the first, to my knowledge at least, Cartoon Network crossover that they called their Toon-Packed issue. This would kickstart their obsession with cartoon crossovers. But that's not all. There is just so much to unpack here because Dexter hadn't been in one of these cartoon crossover compilations since the very first one, but in the middle of the Cartoons compilation series, Dexter's comic would end up coming to an end. So in issue 17, released in June of 2003, Cartoons would welcome Dexter back, and the cover art for the comic would feature Johnny Bravo and Cow and Chicken laughing at him, which is freaking hilarious because this comic just got cancelled. Dexter would end up becoming a regular in the Cartoons run, but that series would eventually come to an end and spawned another. So because Cartoon Network has absolutely no self-control, we would get the Cartoon Network Block Party series. Starting in November of 2004 and ending in September of 2009, wow, this series would be unique to the compilation series that came before. Because unlike the past two compilation series, these Cartoon Network Block Party issues would cross over one or two characters in each issue. So instead of one big crossover event, we got 59 issues of mini crossovers that spanned over 5 years. And at this point in time, Cartoon Network had built up its catalog full of cartoons that were debuting while these comics were running. So they would include everything. No one was safe. Not Dexter, nor the Powerpuff Girls. Everybody was free game. The newer characters would include Camp Laszlo, My Gym Partner's a Monkey, Hi Hi Puffy Amiyumi, and even a few Chowder issues. And I'm pretty sure you already know the pattern by now, so I want you to take a guess on what characters out of everyone in Cartoon Network's catalog that they choose to give their own full comic run. Take a good guess, go ahead. Was it Ed, Ed and Eddie? Maybe Billy and Mandy? What about Codename Kids Next Door? No? Then what? April of 2006, DC Comics would publish the first Hi Hi Puffy Amiyumi comics. And I'm not even complaining, I love Hi Hi Puffy Amiyumi. But out of everything that they had to offer, I'm just so surprised that they picked that. Unsurprisingly, the series would last from April of 2006 until June of 2006. Yeah, it apparently only had 3 issues. They probably could have guessed that to be the case though. It's listed officially as a 3-issue miniseries, so maybe that was their intention after all. But Cartoon Network would go on to create more shows, and those shows would get big, but by this time we were already in the mid to late 2000s. Comic books had been falling in popularity, they were starting to lose all of their relevance. But that wouldn't stop Cartoon Network and DC from giving it one final go, as they would release their final comics under the name Cartoon Network's Action Pack. So starting in July of 2006, this last effort made by Cartoon Network and DC would prove to be well worth it because it would last until April of 2012. At this time, the network was trying to push action cartoons back into the consciousness of the youth, and that's more of what we get here. So that means we kind of get a little bit of everything that the Cartoon Network was offering at the time. Megas XLR, Kids Next Door, Life and Times of Juniper Lee, Samurai Jack, Ben 10, Secret Saturdays, Generator Rex, and they were really pushing the Rowdy Rough Boys as their own group at the time. The emphasis on these comics was definitely action, hence the name, and they leaned deep into that instead of the whole episodic type of run that they were doing before. So no Dexter Slab or Johnny Bravo, none of those type of things, which is unfortunate considering the fact that those characters are what carried the comic book line up until this point. So it would have been really cool to see a final comic that had everybody in it. But after 67 action-packed issues, Cartoon Network and DC Comics would part ways. But now that the DC Comics history is behind us, how do these issues fit into the continuity of their respective series? It's actually really hard to say. For the shows Dexter's Lab, Johnny Bravo, Ed, and Eddie and such, these comics probably wouldn't affect their shows because of their episodic nature. Characters like Dexter go on so many different adventures that it would be hard to break its canon unless a comic book added something or changed something with the series itself. But for the most part, it seems to me that the comics that are a part of the compilation series are not considered to be canon. And clearly because of the various crossovers and the one-off nature of every issue. But something like Dexter's actual 34-issue comic run would be considered canon unless stated otherwise, and I can't really seem to find anything that says definitively that states either way. When discussing the same topic in my Powerpuff Girls comic video, I received a lot of comments from people saying that they do consider them to be canon despite the fact that the comics have a lot of contradictions in them. The Powerpuff Girls only slightly contradict their show in the comics that would predate the episodes that were based off them. Things like the villain him turning into a butterfly in the episode chalked up, but him turning into an old man in the comic book. Bullet the Squirrel being named Twitchy the Squirrel and sporting a red and black cape in the comics. But nothing that completely interrupts the canon of the series. But then we move on to shows whose canon are a bit more important, like Ben 10, Samurai Jack, Adventure Time, and Steven Universe, which I'll go into later. But Ben 10 didn't make a real comic debut into the DC Comics Cartoon Network issues until the Cartoon Network's action series, which I immediately wrote off as non-canon because of all of the crossovers in those events. With shows like Ben 10, every character's canon would have to line up perfectly because unlike shows like Johnny Bravo, these shows have strict timelines that they have to follow. So if Ben 10 is somehow hanging out with Jack and Juniper Lee, we're gonna have to know exactly when he did that and exactly how he came back. So I lean towards saying the action series are in their own canon, but if you thought it was confusing, we haven't even mentioned the other comic distributors yet. This is where the history of Cartoon Network's comics gets a little bit scattered. They bounce back and forth a lot from different publishers, so since you get the gist already, I'll just focus on the question in the title. So some of the most important story-driven shows are Samurai Jack, Adventure Time, Steven Universe, and Ben 10. But how do their comics affect their overarching stories? Let's start with Ben 10. So the DC Comics withstanding, the first comics to truly feature Ben 10 in his own standalone stories would be published by IDW and be called Ben 10, Been Here Before. Volume 1 would run a total of 18 issues, but the Ben 10 wiki says that these are just a compilation of the action-packed issues condensed together. Volume 2 would be the exact same thing, just a condensed version of issues 19 through 26. So maybe they're canon after all? It's also really weird that IDW is able to take the DC Comics issues and republish them. And I haven't read the Ben 10 comics, so I'm not sure how condensing all of them into 2 volumes would affect the show's canon. The issues must be important enough to at least be noted, because if they weren't, then IDW would have just created their own comics. That, or either Cartoon Network was being lazy and just reusing them to avoid having to pay new writers. The recycling of Ben 10's action-packed stories would continue for 3 more volumes, including the Generator Rex crossover until September 8th of 2015. But while they were recycling those stories, IDW was making their own Omniverse comic in 2013. These issues would lead up to Ben 10 being in the IDW crossover event, Cartoon Network's Super Secret Crossover War, which also had Samurai Jack in it, and that will go on for a total of 6 issues. But a little before that, DC Comics would release their own Ben 10 comic in 2012 called No Laughing Matter. From then, Cartoon Network would toss Ben around from publisher to publisher. Boom Comics did a run, Viz Media's Perfect Square did one, Del Rey Manga did one, and that would wrap up Ben's history in comics. But like I said before, it's so scattered and nothing is linear. It's really all over the place. And I mean, can canon travel from different companies? I originally didn't think so, but IDW published DC's old comics in a compilation, so who knows? But when asked if the comics are canon on Twitter, the creator of Ben 10, Duncan Rowlow, has stated that the comics were canon. But the comments under the Reddit post that I found that information on say that he has come out and contradicted that statement. They provided a link to his contradiction, but it doesn't work when I click on it. My personal verdict for Ben 10 is that despite what the creator has stated, I just don't see how all of these can be canon and fit into the same timeline of the series. And if some of the comics are canon, then that's just some of them, while others aren't, but I guess it's up to you to decipher which ones are and which ones aren't. The Samurai Jack run of comics, on the other hand, are a far simpler story to tell. If we're not looking at the DC crossover comics and we're just looking at his comics, then we're left with the comic run from 2013 published by IDW Comics. These comics would go on to have 24 issues and would last 6 years. These issues would introduce characters that we had never seen show up in the series or even be mentioned in the series. And there are pretty big plot contradictions between this run of comics and what we get in the series continuation. These comics came out after the original series ended and before it was rebooted, and since the storylines between the two don't line up, Genndy the creator has already come out to say that these are not canon at all. These comics exist in their very own alternate canon universe. Speaking of universes, Steven Universe also had comics that spanned from 2014 to 2020 as a whole. But even though they're not as important, their question of their canon still stands. I actually own a volume myself, but unlike Ben 10 and Samurai Jack's comics, these comics were made to be less of an overarching story and more of just a little bit of Beach City events. They were made with the intention to just be fun stories with the characters we know and love, while Rebecca would save any main story events for the series. But even though they're not as important, their question of their canon still stands. Because Steven also had 2 games that are supposedly seen as canon, but those don't really fit in with the timeline of the universe. But as far as the issues go, when asked about it on Twitter, the OKKO creator and Rebecca Sugar's husband Ian Jones-Cordy has stated that they should be considered level 2 canon, which pretty much means that they're canon unless the show or the creators say otherwise. So if the books are contradicted in any way, then they should be overlooked because the main canon will always come first in the series. But he has since updated his answer on that, stating that after 2014, the crew behind the series had absolutely no say what happens in the comics. So to put it simply, none of the Steven Universe comics or graphic novels hold any canon towards the actual show.